that there were devout Jews, men from every nation on earth. And in the 10th verse, it talks about those from Africa, from Egypt, Cyrene, and Libya. And so there was an African presence even when the church was born. Now, during the time of Christ, you can see in yellow a depiction of the Roman Empire. And much of Africa was under the authority of the Roman Empire. But you can see in parts of Africa, Cyrene, where Mark, the disciple that wrote the book of Mark, was born. Simon the Cyrenian, the one that helped Christ bear the cross. Alexandria, Egypt, where a number of theologians that we'll talk about tonight came from, as well as Carthage, where Tertullian and Cyprian, which we'll hear about today, and Thagast, where St. Augustine hails from. So we're going to be talking about Africa. Much of the church history that you get starts at Jerusalem, goes through Europe, and comes to the United States. But we have a different story, a different lineage, and ours comes from Jerusalem. And when Christ says, "Go ye therefore and teach all nations, all ethnos," there was a movement south as well, and that's what we're going to talk about today. There were 4 centers of Christendom at the early church stage, the first few centuries of Christianity. There was Jerusalem, where James, the brother of Jesus, was the first bishop. Antioch, where we got the term Christians, where Peter was the first bishop. Rome, where both Peter and Paul were martyred. And Alexandria, where Mark planted the first church in Africa. And amongst these 4, by far the most prolific was the African Egyptian Alexandria. This is in the walled city of Jerusalem. I was there a year ago, and there is a chapel that's dedicated to Simon of Cyrene on the Via Dolorosa, where Christ was going on his way to be crucified. Here is where he fell, and they compelled Simon to bear the cross, and they've commemorated a chapel in his honor. Now, Christ's tomb you can see depicted here. That's the tomb of Christ that a Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built over. And on the top of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the Ethiopian church. And this is what it looks like inside. The Ethiopians have been in Jerusalem since the time of the Queen of Sheba. It says in Kings that he gave her all that was on her heart. But one of the things he gave her was some property in the walled city. And so those Ethiopians have been there up until today. So here I was worshiping them on last year. This is the Archbishop of Jerusalem. And in the 1st century, you had an African, the Ethiopian eunuch, proselytizing other Africans, where he went back. He was the finance minister for his queen, and she became the first head of state. And this church is in the walled city of Jerusalem, dedicated to St. Philip, who was the one that baptized the Ethiopian eunuch. This is St. Mark. St. Mark was born in Africa. He's African. His people had been there for 400 years, since the time of the Maccabean Wars. And he wrote the Gospel of Mark. He founded the first African church, and he was martyred in 68 AD. And this is a mosaic that's actually in the chapel called St. Mark's that I visited in Alexandria last year. This is what the church looks like today. And this relief shows every bishop for the first 7 centuries, starting with the Apostle Mark, who was the first bishop of Alexandria. And all the bodies are buried underneath this church. This is a mosaic depicting the life of St. Mark. You can see they bound his hands, they put a rope around his neck, and they dragged him over some jagged rocks until his head decapitated from his body. And that's how he was martyred. And that's the tomb. And his relics are there in that church. Clement of Alexandria was a part of the first seminary in the world. Okay, when Mark founded the church, they also founded a seminary. And Clement of Alexandria was the head of this seminary, and his most famous pupil was Origen. Origen was a genius, a theological genius, the first systematic theologian. He wrote thousands of books. He had a Bible with 6 different translations in it. He translated the Bible into Syriac, Coptic, the vernacular, Latin, Hebrew, Greek. He knew it all. And it was him that founded another seminary in Caesarea Marina, and Pamphilus was the one that he tutored, and Pamphilus is the one that mentored Eusebius, and Eusebius is the one that wrote the first 300 years of the Christian history. So no one else wrote in that space that Eusebius wrote in. So Eusebius is to Christianity just as Josephus is to the Jews. This is Athanasius. Athanasius, another amazing African theologian. His detractors called him the Black Dwarf because of his stature and his dark complexion. But he's the one, as a deacon, that went to the Council of Nicaea of 325 and made the case for Jesus Christ, his full deity and his full humanity. And we have the Athanasius Creed. He also wrote a book on the life of St. Anthony that made St. Anthony an international sensation. They knew about St. Anthony all over the world because of his works. And he also became a bishop of Alexandria and ordained the first bishop in the Ethiopian church, where the Coptic church was over Ethiopian church up until the 20th century. All the bishops were being ordained in Ethiopia from those in Egypt. And this is St. Anthony. And St. Anthony the Great was sitting in church one day. He was a teenager. He lost both parents, and he heard where the preacher was reading in Mark, "Sell all that you have, give it to the poor, and come and follow me." He felt as if it was him the preacher was speaking to. So he sold everything he had and gave it to the villagers and kept back only a small amount for his sister to get some training with the nuns and get an education. And he went out into the desert believing that God needed a standard in the wilderness because this is where the spirits, the evil spirits dwelt. And so he went into a cave. And in that cave he practiced the disciplines, prayer, meditation. And God gave him so many gifts of healing, of miracles. And as he was wrestling with the demons beat him and bloodied him. And when his friends came to see him, they found him laying outside, half dead. They picked him up and took him back to the church in Egypt, in Alexandria, and it was there that they thought he was going to die, and they had a wake for him, and he was laying there. And in the midnight hour, he got up, went back out and spent the next 30 years in that cave. This is the monastery that he founded. Monasticism started in Africa. He was not the first monk, but he was the first one to make it popular. There were tens of thousands of men that went into the deserts to be monks. And the monastery movement spread to Europe and throughout the world. This is a church dedicated to him within that monastery. This is Lazarus the priest, who has lived there since 1996, much like St. Anthony. This is the entrance to the cave that he lived in. And this is what the cave looks like. This man lived in this cave for 30 years. Another desert father, St. Pachomius. St. Pachomius is the first one to start a monastery where it wasn't just one guy isolated, but it was a group of monks living together. Pachomius. And this is Pachomius' monastery that I had a chance to visit a few months ago. This is one of his monks. He's the head cook, and he was so proud of these beans that I ate. And this is a painting inside the monastery. If you Google Pachomius, you're going to see a picture of a man with baby blue eyes. but as you can see, the man has brown eyes. So I was keen to go and see for myself what this African looked like. Now, this is the monastery at Wadi El Natrum. This is also in Egypt, another of the Desert Fathers, and this is Moses the Black. Moses the Black was a bad boy. He was a slave in Egypt, Ethiopian. He had a band of 72 guys. They went around raping, killing, pillaging, stealing. And when he came to this monastery and he met those monks, he just fell on his knees and wept and begged them that he would repent of his sins. He wanted to live amongst them. He became a great desert father. A lot of wisdom we get from Moses the Black. And this is the dining hall. This is a monk. He's a young man actually from Egypt that decided to come and become a monk. And this is where they eat. And this is St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai where Moses got the 10 Commandments. This is the burning bush. 5,000 years later, it still blooms every year, where Moses stood with his shoes off, standing on holy ground. Tertullian, a lawyer, also an African, he's the one that came up with the term Trinitary, or Trinitas. So when we talk about Trinitarianism, this is the man that articulated that. And when we hear the Nicene Creed, light from light, true God from true God, that's a direct quotation from Tertullian. Cyprian, considered the greatest theologian of the 3rd century. He's the one that held the church together during the persecution, when Diocletian was killing people, saying that you have to burn incense, burn your Bible, and curse Christ, or be killed. African Christians were killed by the thousands. They were murdered by the tens of thousands. But there were some that, under the threat of death, lapsed, the so-called lapsarians. And so when the persecution lifted, these priests and deacons and men of the church wanted to come back into fellowship. But it was Donatus who said, no, you're anathema, you can't come back in, you betrayed Christ. But it was Cyprian that came up with the moderated view. You're going to do some penance, you're going to be restored to service, and brought back into the fold. And that's Donatus. And they fought the full weight of the Roman army to the death. He would be termed our first liberation theologian. St. Augustine, you guys know St. Augustine, but you might not know that St. Augustine was born in Africa, ministered in Africa, died in Africa. He did go up to Europe and give some lectures, but why they call him a Western theologian is beyond me, because Africa is in the East, and he ministered in the East. So we can claim him in the lineage of the great African theologians. All of the major doctrines of Christianity were hammered out on the African continent. The deity of Christ, the humanity of Christ, the Trinity, salvation by faith in Christ, and the grace of God. These were articulated by great theologians in the first few centuries leading up to the Council of Nicaea. And at the Council of Nicaea, with the 256 bishops that came together from all over the world, this is what Canon 6 reads. Let the ancient customs in Egypt, Libya, Pentapolis prevail, that the Bishop of Alexandria have jurisdiction in all of these. In other words, what the Africans have been doing for the last few centuries, we affirm. Now this is a Coptic church in Sharm el-Sheikh. I was there for the Orthodox Easter celebration on last year and had a chance to worship with thousands of believers there. Now we move to Ethiopia. So Christianity started in Jerusalem, got planted first in Egypt, went down to Nubia, and into Ethiopia. Ethiopia became a Christian nation in 325 AD, a Christian nation. 50 years before Rome. This is a church of the Holy Trinity that was built by Haile Selassie, the last sitting emperor of the bloodline of Solomon. One of the things that the Queen of Sheba got from Solomon was a son, Menelik I, who sat on the throne. And when Menelik became a young man, he went back to see his father in Jerusalem. His father wanted him to stay. He would not stay. He got the sons of Zadok and the Ark of the Covenant and took it back to Ethiopia, where it is today. This is the Church of the Holy Trinity. If you look up at the ceiling, you'll see the Star of David and you'll see the cross of Christ. They have a continuity of understanding and theology of the old and new being related, and that there are elements of both that they hold to even today. Now, also, you'll see this huge stained glass window going way up of St. Matthew and St. Thomas. They commemorate the fact that both of these disciples preached in Ethiopia. And it was Matthew that was martyred, gave his life planting the church in Ethiopia in the 1st century. Now, this is the Holy Trinity University in Ethiopia, and so I went there to do some research in the library, and the books are written in Ge'ez, the ancient language of the Ethiopians, in Amharic. And here, Tessima actually graduated with his doctorate in ministry. We were classmates at DTS a few years ago, and so he hosted me while I was there. And he's reading, giving the account that in Nubia, you had Matthew, Thomas, and Bartholomew in Nubia discussing who would come in and disciple the Ethiopians. And it was agreed that Matthew would come in, and Matthew went in. So here you see, in the 1st century, Africa was not forgotten, but was a part of the Great Commission from the very beginning. And this is the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Church in New Jersey. And I worship with these guys. Priest Amde is African American, but they perform all of the rites the same way they did some 2,000 years ago in that church, and have continued that. If you go to their service, you will see them praying the same prayers they prayed 2,000 years ago, reading the same liturgy. It's an amazing experience, using the same instruments. So now we move from Ethiopia to the Congo Kingdom in West Central Africa. King Jawo was the king of the Congo, and when he became a Christian, he deemed the entire nation to be Christian. And his son, Alfonso I, took it to the next level, fell asleep reading his Bible, built churches, schools, sent people to Rome for training, thousands of baptisms annually. Money is being put into the teaching of the faith. But he had a problem with the king of Belgium, of Portugal, king of Portugal. And his problem was, articulated in this letter that he sent, each day the traitors are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need in this kingdom only priests and school teachers, and no merchandise unless it is wine and flour for mass. It is our wish that this kingdom not be a place for the transport of slaves. Many of our subjects eagerly lust after Portuguese merchandise that your subjects have brought into our domains. To satisfy this inordinate appetite, they seize many of our black free subjects. They sell them after having taken these prisoners to the coast secretly or at night. As soon as the captives are in the hands of white men, they are branded with the red-hot iron. John III of Portugal, he wrote this letter, and he got no response. And so he wrote another letter. In this kingdom, faith is as fragile as glass, because the bad examples of the men who come to teach here, because the lusts of the world and the lure of wealth have turned them away from the truth. Just as the Jews crucified the Son of God because of covetousness, my brother, so today he is again crucified. But what King Alfonso didn't know was that the King of Portugal was doing just what he had been given authority to do by the Pope, Pope Nicholas V. This is what Pope Nicholas V told the kings of Europe to do to the African Christians: to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. You go in there, take whatever you want, enslave them forever. This was the Pope. This brought about circumstances for Kempa Vita. Now, Kempa Vita, when she was a teenager, she fell ill and she died. Or so they thought she died. After several days, they were having a funeral. And during the funeral, she woke up. And of course, everybody scattered. And when they came back, she said, I had a vision from God. And the Congo people are children of God. Whites are not superior or better in God's eyes. They're also black angels. And the Congo kingdom must unite. And as children of God, Congo must be free. Sacraments don't save, faith does. So you had some of these priests coming from Portugal, and they were selling them trinkets, good luck charms as it were. They were making them pay for baptism. And she was saying, this is an abomination. It's what's in your heart that's going to save you, not these things. She had a church of 70,000. That was her first mega church. She so enraged the Europeans, this talk of freedom, this talk of not going along with the program of being subjugated. We're going to have to get rid of her. And so, after a time, they tied her to a tree, and they whipped her, and they beat her, that she would recant her faith, that she would say that the things that she was saying, that she would back away from, and she would not. And so, they got a big mess of sticks and lit a fire and burned her alive with her infant in her arms. And they took the ashes and they scattered them in the sea, saying, we don't want that there to be any memorial to her, and we're done with this whole idea, this freedom talk she's talking about. But this didn't kill the idea. And the people were more determined than ever they would not be enslaved, because as those made in God's image, they were to be free. They were on equal footing with anybody else. And so what they did was they rounded them up by the thousands, and they sent them two places. One, Charleston, South Carolina, and two, Haiti. Now, as you may know, the only successful slave rebellion in the world happened in Haiti. And while they were fighting, they were chanting Kempa Vita, Kempa Vita. She inspired many. This is a Congo crucifix, and if you notice, the features of Christ are very Afrocentric. If you look at the lips, you look at the nose, this enraged the Europeans. How dare they see Christ as a black man? The Congo Kingdom was a Christian nation. They were practicing Christianity 128 years before the first slave ships brought them to the American colonies. So for generations, we were practicing Christianity as a state religion before the first slave ships. They were recognized by the Vatican for 250 years as a Christian nation. And they built religious schools and sent students to Rome for training, and they recorded thousands of baptisms annually. This is how they linked them together in chains, and the slave ships went everywhere. You can see, coming from the Congo, Charleston, New Orleans. There's a Congo town in New Orleans even today, and you've heard of Mardi Gras. It's a takeoff of the African tradition as they prepare for Lent. And so 5 million went to Brazil. There are more blacks in Brazil than in the U.S. And so this slave trade went over the whole world, and everybody got involved, the Catholics, the Protestants. And these are the Sea Islands. So there's Charleston, South Carolina, but all these barrier sea islands going from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. But I call your attention to this island, St. Helena Island, because this is the island where both sets of my grandparents came from and my father came from, and they brought Christianity with them. For the first 100 years of slavery, all the slaves came from the Congo Kingdom. So all my African American brothers and sisters sitting in here, if you do your DNA, you're going to find somewhere some Bantu, some Congo. Okay? This is me 33 years ago landing in the Congo Kingdom. I didn't know at the time that I was going to my ancestral homeland. I just knew that my wife and I, we were students at Johns Hopkins. We were going to spend 3 months in what was then called Zaire with the Baptist Mission Board doing medical missions work. We stayed with Mwaba and Josie, his wife, and their 3 children in a 1-room house with no plumbing or electricity. We washed our clothes outside. This was the shower behind these bamboo sticks here. The outhouse was over here. Every day there was something tied out in front of the house, some animal. There was no refrigeration. At noon, they slaughter the animal. Everybody comes and gets whatever they want. We ate out of the same bowl. And everybody was convinced I was from the Congo because I had the same features, same everything. So you must be from here. When I did my DNA, I verified, yes, that's where I'm from. And this is Pastor Wole, who was my mentor, a surgeon, that I was doing my rotation. And Kinga was my interpreter because they spoke Lingala, Swahili, and some other languages, and they spoke French because of the Belgian influence. And so I had the most wonderful time while I was there. I would go to church. I didn't speak Kikongo or Lingala, but when they started playing those drums and playing those instruments, something came out of me, something familiar that had translated 400 years later. That cultural identity was still there. The worship of the Lord was the same. My wife on the pediatric ward, she's a pediatrician, and that's me in the tan there. We had just come, and people had come from 3 days' journey because they heard the doctors. This was a surgery team, and we had everybody there. They would blow in a big elephant tusk and making merry before we got to work the next day. And the first person that came in was a woman who was 9 months pregnant, bleeding profusely from that vaginal area with a condition we call placenta previa, where the placenta, rather than being on top of the womb, it's on the bottom of the womb. And if the woman doesn't get an immediate C-section, both she and the baby are lost. And we were able to do that C-section, and they called that rascal Frank. The highlight of my trip. We did immunization campaigns. We would go walk for hours to villages We would see mothers under a tree. We'd weigh their babies, bring them food, medications. We got around on the Quilo River and dug out canoe. And now the Stono Rebellion. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 took place in South Carolina. Remember I told you that they shipped those Africans over because they had too much, you know, they didn't make good slaves. So they sent them over. And what happened was the preachers got together. They beat the drums. And people from all of the different plantations knew to come together. They broke into a munitions store, got weapons, ammunition, and went from house to house, executing the slave master and putting his head on a stick. And if they came to a house where the master was a nice master, they kept moving. But they reserved this judgment for those they considered to be the harsh, cruel masters. And as they were going to the Savannah River, because if they got across the Savannah River, they would get freedom, because the Spaniards had a fort in St. Augustine, and they were promising freedom. And so a lot of Africans had escaped there and lived in freedom and were never enslaved. Tens of thousands in St. Augustine, which is named by St. Augustine, the theologian, by the way, and they were headed off at the pass, and the rebellion was put down, the Stono Rebellion. Here's something in Florida. You had the Africans that had escaped. They joined up with the Creek Indians, and they fought for freedom against the settlers, and General Jackson was unable to conquer them, and they actually had a peace treaty, and they went west, but these people fought with the Creek Indians. This is George Liele. He began preaching in 1773, and he was the pastor of the First African Baptist Church in Savannah. I'm from Savannah. This is the oldest Baptist church in North America, and if you go in there, you will see in the floor openings where the slaves, as part of the Underground Railroad, where the slaves would hide out as they were trying to travel north or south if they were trying to get to St. Augustine. Well, when he got his freedom, rather than being re-enslaved, he went to Jamaica, where he did a huge revival, and the Jamaicans had a big ministry going back to Ghana, and they planted cocoa trees, which are part of their economy even today. And they said, we heard a message, a prophecy, that men of God would come and plant trees. So they welcomed him with open arms, and they proselytized, and a large Christian church grew out of that ministry. George Liele. George David was the second in command, and many of the Africans, the slaves, joined with the British, because the British said, if we win, you get land and freedom. Well, the British, of course, lost. So what to do with all of these Africans who were promised these things? They let them go up to Nova Scotia in Canada, and he had a large congregation. He had 1,000 people in his congregation, and they went back to West Africa, to Sierra Leone, and planted churches and proselytized on the west coast of Africa, going into the interior. And Paul Cuffey, he was a Quaker merchant. His father was African, his mother was an Indian, and he's the one that ferried them back and forth to Sierra Leone, where they could do their missions work and live in freedom. And that's Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa there. That's Freetown, the capital city. Remember I told you that they stopped bringing slaves from the Congo because of the rebellions. And because the slaves outnumbered the whites 4-1, they couldn't even sleep in their beds at night. So they said, don't bring any more Africans here. So they stopped with slavery. They never brought any more slaves from the Congo. But when they resumed slavery, they went to the west coast, to Sierra Leone. And they would capture them in this barracoon and wait for the ships to come, take them off the coast to Bounce Island, and you can see the British flag there, and take them all over the Americas. Charleston, 1769, to be sold a cargo of 94 healthy prime Negroes. to be sold on board the ship Bounce Island, 250 fine, healthy Negroes from the Rice and Windward coast. And again, the Sea Islands. That's the one that I'm intimately associated with. This is life on St. Helena during slavery. That's a typical cabin. That's the Praise House. Remember I told you they brought Christianity with them? 3 nights a week, when they finished their duties, they'd slip into the bush, they'd get in this praise house, and they would sing and dance and do something called the ring shout, preach all night, and then before daybreak, go back and start over again. 3 nights a week, they continued this. They had baptisms, they buried facing the east, just like they do in Jerusalem, waiting for that getting up day, as they call it, the resurrection, the return of Christ. And this is even the children picking cotton, mending fishing nets. When slavery ended, there was a big debate. What kind of education should the Negroes get? Should they get the trades or should they get the professions? So Booker T. Washington and W. Du Bois came to St. Helena and had great debates there. And they favored Booker T. Washington because they had all the trades there, shoe repair, husbandry. They did teach the children to read. They got history lessons. This is my mother's mother, my grandmother holding her first grandchild, my daughter Danielle, who's now practicing law in Buckhead. She was Gullah. And her husband Archie, World War I veteran, Gullah. Both of them were born and raised in St. Helena. And that's my father's mother, also from St. Helena, Victoria. And this is what Gullah sounds like. This is what I heard growing up every day. Just like Moses done heist the bronze snake upon the bull day in the wilderness. Same way, so they're going to have the man will come from God. So everybody will believe man ain't going to get true life, what ain't going to never end. Because God loved all the people in the world so much that he gave his only his son. God sent him so that everybody will believe one ain't going dead. They want to live favor more. God ain't sent his son in the world for to condemn them. God sent his son for to save the people through his son. This is what I heard. So when I went to Africa, when English meets the African mind, it comes out like that. And so I could hear very clearly what they were saying when I went as a medical student to Liberia, West Africa. This is Liberia, West Africa. And that's me preaching a few years ago. And James Garway, to my left there, he's the one that's translating because I'm speaking to some Gio people and they don't understand English. So he's translating for me. He came to Albany State, where I live in Albany, and got his master's in hospital administration. He's now the hospital administrator for the SIM hospital in Liberia. And that's me. You heard Dr. Hawkins reference me testifying before Congress. I had taken teams of 50 doctors over to Liberia, and we would spread out. We had all the different specialties represented, and we just spread out providing services. And so when the Ebola broke, me having a doctorate in public health and me having some understanding of Ebola, having been in the Congo where Ebola started, in the Ebola River, they called me as a mature witness to see what we might do to keep it from jumping off here. And so we put together some plans. They put $5.7 billion together that day. 3,000 troops went over. They built Ebola treatment units. Now we have a vaccine, so you don't hear much about Ebola now. And this is my wife on the left here, Marcia, and she's getting some cola nuts here as the villagers have donated 500 acres of land that we might build a school of medicine, a school of public health, school of nursing, and they're looking forward to that. And the Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. And if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, that we might be also glorified together. For I reckon the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Thank you. I'll entertain any questions.
Has done here because he has really, I think, opened up even more eyes, even you all here this evening, to show that not only is Christianity having, not only are we Christians legitimately, but we have something to say, right? We have something to say. We have something to contribute, and so going to have the first question tonight with Dr. Marshall.
Thank you, Dr. Glover, for the presentation, but I have a question.
Yes.
My question was, I was over in the Holy Land around 2006 or 7, and it was the year that the Jewish nation had went and brought back 277 Ethiopian Jews. Do you get any information when you have been going to the Holy Land about that, and what can you say to that?
Yes, yes. I have seen them. They're called the Fasala Jews, and it was Operation Solomon, where the Jews, the Ethiopian Jews, were being persecuted, and so them being black Jews, there was some question about their legitimacy, but the rabbis affirmed that yes, these are Jews, and we have to accept them back. So they live in a community together, but they have been practicing Judaism in Ethiopia for a very, very long time. As you'll recall, Moses' wife was Ethiopian, and her father, therefore, would be Ethiopian, Jethro, who the priest of Salem mentored in those 40 years that Moses spent in the desert learning of God. This was a man of God. And so the people of Ethiopia were expecting, they were Messianic Jews waiting for Christ to come. And when Christ did come, you read in the Bible where the 3 wise men from the east came. Well, the king of Ethiopia, King Basan, B-A-S-A-N, brought the frankincense. So they were part of the story from the very beginning.
I actually have 2, and they're related. One, in all of my learning, we're taught that the first Gentiles that were converted are in Acts chapter 10 instead of Acts chapter 8, where that Ethiopian eunuch was converted. And I've never understood that, and I was hoping you can give some clarification to that for us. And then secondly, I was in Israel last year in April, and I was under the impression, I can't remember the book I read years ago, that Ethiopia was actually the first nation to convert to Christianity. You may want to correct that, but the tour guide said it was Armenia, and that that nation was Christian from like the 1st century, 2nd century. So if you can speak to that, I appreciate it.
Okay, so your first question about the Ethiopian eunuch. Remember when he was sitting in the chariot, he was reading from the scroll of Isaiah, and he had gone to the temple to worship. So he would be Jewish, not Gentile. Okay? He's Jewish, you see. And so there's a lot of controversy about Jews and who's a Jew, who's a real Jew. But clearly the Ethiopians were Jewish. The Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia. Every church in Ethiopia has a model tablet or Ark of the Covenant. So they still hold to that. And when you see the relics of the priest, they're still wearing the same things that the ancient Jewish priests wore. Okay, the same thing Aaron wore. Okay, from the Levitical priesthood. So they're Jews for sure. And your second question? Oh, okay. So who's first? You're never going to answer that question, but here's the important thing. Christianity swept through Africa 1,000 years before the first Europeans came. So when the Portuguese came to Nubia, and it says we're bringing Christianity, we did the excavations and showed that they had churches from the 3rd century. And when you look at the church reliefs, you'll see men worshiping in the church in Nubia with the relics and clothing of Africans from as far south as Ghana. So that means that Nubia, in the 1st century, remember I told you that Bartholomew, Thomas, and Matthew were there walking in that land. The church was planted, and the Nubia would actually fight anybody that would attack Egypt. They would mount the cross, and they would send an army and defend those Egyptians. The Nubians were the Nubian Christians. Now, when you had Muhammad born in 622 AD, and you had this big thing with Islam, the Nubians were not conquered because the Nubians had archers that were so fierce they could put a man's eye out from 100 yards. And so they were unable to, so that what they did, what those Arabs did, they said, listen, we're not going to hurt you, you don't hurt us. And they had a 1,000-year agreement where Christianity flourished in Nubia, which is modern-day Sudan. And if you look at the map, you'll see the Congo borders it. So what does that mean? That means that Christianity swept through Africa well before the Europeans came. Okay? So that we know. And so in 325 AD, they're a Christian nation. Ethiopia is. The nation's Christian. But in the 1st century, Jesus' disciples were there preaching and planting the church. So Christianity was there early, from the very beginning. Okay? So no one can answer the question who's first, but the important thing is we were early adopters, and Christianity is an indigenous religion of Africa. We got it as early as anyone else. And Christianity didn't get to Britain until the 7th century. Okay, they hadn't heard about Christ till the 7th century.
Brother Danny?
Oh, okay. Listen, just want to say, really appreciate your presentation. But what I'd like to know is, will your presentation be available for the public anytime soon, book form, that kind of thing? I would love to have that at my house so I can speak from that.
Well, thank you for that question. I'm actually writing a book right now, and the book is entitled God's Black Children. And the book is written for the layperson. It's not a theological treatise to sit in someone's library, but it's going to tell the story as simply as you heard me tell it here. What our youth need to know, because the biggest problem we have with our youth today, they're suffering from an identity crisis. They have been told that they're nothing, they come from nothing, they're never going to amount to nothing. And so they walk around with this mentality that they have no history. But if they get to know their history and experience their history, they'll understand that the first civilization came from Africa. I didn't show you a slide, but Dinkesh, or Lucy as the Westerners call the oldest fossil, is in Ethiopia. I saw it just a few months ago. And all of the anthropologists agree the cradle of civilization starts in Africa. All people migrated out of Africa, and all Africans in their history will tell you that we migrated from the east. And when you look at the tombs the Egyptians have going back 5,000 years before Christ, it's an ancient civilization. And all of the philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they studied in Egypt. Herodotus studied in Egypt. Pythagoras Spent 22 years studying mathematics in Egypt. They built the pyramids 2,200 years before he was born. So how does it become his theory? They were using it in Africa to navigate what was happening with the Nile. They had seafarers. They had astronomers. They had the first medicine. We talk about the Hippocratic Oath, but Hippocrates went and studied under the masters for 7 years in Egypt. So Imhotep is the father of medicine, and he lived 2,000 years before. Okay, so if our people can see that, and see what happened to me was, I experienced it. I'm telling you something that I've seen and experienced myself. So we're going to get young people involved. They need to go and see some of these things. Because once they get a handle on it, it's a wrap. That's why you see this huge push right now against African American studies. Because they understand the power of knowledge. If you know that you'll sit down in that school and get your lesson, because you got brilliant people in your heritage. Yeah. So.
One quick question. The areas in Africa, and to get to Africa is that flight, 22 hours. That's the only way you can get that kind of training.
Okay. Let me just say, it's not 22 hours.
Do you have to go to Africa to get this kind of training?
Yeah, okay, the question is, everybody can't go to Africa, and that's true. But all these people that you heard me talk about, you can go and read what they wrote. You don't have to hear someone else say about what they said. These books are thin. Okay, Athanasius wrote a book on the incarnation. A little thin book. Never been a book written more significant. So when you hear the Athanasius Creed, it's something he formulated based on his understanding of who Christ is from the scriptures and what the disciples taught. So there's a role for learning. There's a role for the internet. But for our young people, they need to go and see. See, a lot of African Americans, we get a little bit of money, we head straight to Europe. There's nothing wrong with Europe. I've been to Europe, been all over Europe. But there are some jewels in Africa. The most beautiful city in the world, Cape Town, South Africa. Go to it. You want to see the Serengeti, you want to see the animals, go to East Africa. Go to Kenya, go to Tanzania, go to Uganda. These places in our minds we've been told they're fearsome, you shouldn't go, it's dangerous. It's not true. You go to Egypt, you're going to eat some good food. There's a reason that the children of Israel said we miss all this food. Okay? Oh, they got some good food now. And you can cruise along the Nile. You can see the beautiful Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. There's so much to see. And the people are inviting and warm. And they will greet you as a brother, as a sister. But we have to get out of our comfort zone and explore. So one of the things our church is doing is we've got a trip planned. I did a presentation at my church, and surprisingly, the teenagers got real excited. So the pastor says we're going to Egypt. So a group of teenagers, and we're going to go. And those are going to be the people that's going to make the difference in the next generation. Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you for your questions. We're going to turn it over to our president. Put your hands together one more time. Dr. Glover, Dr. Ford.
Do that again. No, I'm just. Let's thank God again for Dr. Glover and his.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
It's that kind of richness that I think we need to appreciate, that God has given us a platform to let this be heard. Not only heard, but spread and encouraging. I think it's important that we recognize, as he mentioned, the heritage that we have, not just in America, not even just in the world, but in Christendom. Our being a Bible college in this day, I talked about that this morning, didn't I? That it was not by accident that God preserved us for 95 years to this moment in time so that we can make a difference in this world. And so thank you. Thank you, Dr. Glover. It's exciting to hear. Thank you, Dr. Kevin, for your leadership in bringing this to fruition. And I want you to take advantage of this, because in the sphere of influence that you have in your ministries, in your communities, in your homes, in your family, in your life, that's what we're trying to equip you with. We're equipping you to be competent servant leaders with a Bible-centered worldview. Because if we decenter the Word of God from our lives and from our education, everything else is off-kilt. And it's been off-kilt. And it's time to get it right. So we thank you for your coming. Dr. Kevin shared some others that we're bringing in. Listen, we don't want to bring these powerful speakers and these powerful people of faith and they have chairs to talk to. We want to see you in the place. But we thank God for our virtual balcony. We're working on it. We're working on it. The vision is to have that whole back wall full of people from all over the world that'll be able to interact with us. We're not going to bridge the digital gap. We're going to close it. In fact, we may just take a whole nother route and do something they haven't even thought of yet. You keep messing with us. All right, so thank you. I know our students have to go to class, and y'all could be here all night doing this, right? All right, but thank you again, Dr. Kevin and Dr. Glover.
Thank you. Thank you. I know some smart people, don't I? And so we thank you, brother.
All right.
All right. So you get a chance to say hello to them on your way out, on your way to